Hello again, World Geography students. It is now time for a real quick review video on Asia and Oceania. So let's go ahead and get right to it. So Asia and Oceania, this is of course referring to the whole area that is in East and Southeast Asia as well as Oceania. And Oceania of course refers to Australia and New Zealand as well as the Pacific Islands. So we kind of group this whole area together because they're right near each other. So let's go ahead and get to it. First of all, let's talk about Asia. Now, Asia has a very complex history, and unfortunately, there are many different parts of Asia that are experiencing conflict. And there's three areas that I really want to highlight for you that I have seen your SOL as well as your final exam ask you about. So the first area is this tiny little island off the coast of mainland China, which was originally known as the island of Formosa. But during the Chinese Revolution, communists claimed mainland China, which is right up here, and the nationalists, so not the communists, fled to the island of Formosa and created the independent state known today as Taiwan. And even today, there is still conflict between the mainland China and Taiwan over who has rightful ownership of this island. So this is also a great example of how a name has changed on our map, because before the Chinese Revolution, this island was called something very different, but then after it was called Taiwan. So that's an important example of a name change. All right, now another example of a conflict that's happening in Asia is over the region of Kashmir, which is this little orange area right here, which is right on the border between India and Pakistan, this little region called Kashmir. So basically, the dominant religion of India is Hinduism, and the dominant religion of Pakistan is Islam. And these two religions don't get along very well, especially in this particular area of the world. So as a result, really, this area is creating a conflict between the Hindus and Muslims in this area, and both countries are continuing to fight over the region known as Kashmir. But it's important to note that it's not just two religions that are fighting. It's really these two countries that are at conflict with each other over who rightfully owns or occupies this area known as Kashmir. And unfortunately, it is the site of a lot of violence. All right, another area of conflict in Asia is going to be over in the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War, of course, was the war between North Korea and South Korea, the communist North and the democratic South. And the war was fought between 1950 and 1953, which resulted in two Koreas. And so today, Korea is still divided at the 38th parallel, and North Korea is still a communist nation, while South Korea is a democratic nation. And of course, while there is obviously more peace today, a peace treaty has never officially been signed by these two nations. All right, so now let's get away from areas of conflict and let's talk about some physical characteristics of Asia. What is Asia actually like? So there's a lot of different varied climates in this part of the world, but there are some natural hazards, which include monsoons, typhoons, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes. Now remember, a monsoon is almost like a tropical storm that happens in and around India. A typhoon is basically what we think of as a hurricane, except it happens in the Pacific Ocean. A way that I remember this is because there's a P in typhoon, I think of P for Pacific. It's a hurricane that happens in the Pacific Ocean. Now, throughout this part of the world, there's a very heavy influence of rivers and mountains on Southeast Asia's population and settlement. For example, you may have heard of something called the Himalayas, which did, of course, limit people's ability to spread out and to settle. In India, for example, the Ganges River and the Brahmaputra River, they are known for extreme flooding. So as a result, there has been some limits to who can settle on that river, as well as who can actually and what can actually be transported on these rivers. All right, now let's look at some economic characteristics of Asia. And as a reminder, when we talk about economics, we're talking about how a country or a region makes money or spends money, or basically what they do with their money. Now, throughout the region, there are varied economies. Some countries have communist economies, others have capitalists. Some countries are developed, some countries are developing. But there are some newly industrialized countries in this part of the world, such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, which are rapidly coming to the front of the global market. However, there are some countries that are extremely poor and developing. And as I said, while others are highly developed with very strong infrastructure. So there's a lot of variety in this part of the world between developed and developing countries. Japan, however, is the economic leader of the region. However, it has very limited natural resources. Why is that? Well, if we think of Japan, we remember that Japan is an island. It's an archipelago of a group of islands. And so it has very limited natural resources, but it is, of course, known for technology. All right, some other economic characteristics of Asia. Hong Kong and Singapore, these are two islands that are completely surrounded by water, and so they are island sites. Varanasi, India is a pilgrimage point for Hinduism. Remember, when we think of India, we should really think of Hinduism, the most common religion in India, while Shintoism is found exclusively in Japan. Now, another important characteristic of Asia is that the population is very unevenly spread out. There are some areas where the population is very, very dense. People are packed very tightly together, and other areas where they are very, very spread out. So those very packed tightly together cities, and then they have very spread out rural areas. Plus, this region of the world is home to a lot of religious diversity, including Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Taoism, Shintoism, and Confucianism. So this region of the world, even though there are some more dominant religions, you can find many different religions in this part of the world. All right, now let's take a look at Oceania. So Oceania, which of course we've talked about, refers to Australia, the Pacific Islands, and New Zealand, is just south and southeast of Asia. Now this area of the world has a very wide range of vegetation, ranging from tropical rainforests to desert shrubs. But let's talk about Australia specifically. Australia is mostly a desert climate, with the exception of course, the mountain range, the Great Dividing Range, and the Great Barrier Reef on the coast. Meanwhile, New Zealand, which is the island just off the coast of Australia, has a marine west coast climate, which is very similar to our Pacific Northwest climate up there by Washington and Oregon State. But this whole region does have a very wide range of vegetation. In the Pacific Islands, for example, you can find more rainforests. So we have Pacific Island rainforests, Australia is very dry, and New Zealand has a marine west coast climate, a very wet climate. Now, some other characteristics of Oceania, they are very isolated. For example, if you look at Australia, Australia has a lot of weird animals. Why is that? It's because Australia and New Zealand, which also has kind of funky animals, are isolated geographically from the rest of the world. So they have very different animals than other parts of the world because obviously the animals, unless they can swim, can't really get to other parts of the world. As a result of all of this, water, air, and water travel are essential to bring goods and services, especially when we talk about those Pacific Islands that are out there and isolated all on their own. So that's where air and water travel, boats, canoes, those are going to be, or even motorboats are going to be useful. Also, before we go to our next slide, a quick reminder about the Australian population is mainly along the coast. As we've talked about before with Australia, the interior of Australia, or the outback, as it's popularly known, is very dry. And so the vast majority of Australia's population is going to be found along the coast, specifically the east coast, where we have the bigger cities as well as the capital territory of Canberra. And so that's where the population is going to settle, pretty much because that's where the water is, that's where trade is going to be available, those where the cities are. All right, some important cultural characteristics that you need to know for this region. Of course, as we've talked about, the main primary agriculture, primary level of economic activity in Australia is going to be cattle and sheep stations. Because most of Australia is so dry, it does not have good arable land, and so people rely on cattle and sheep herding in the interior of Australia to make money. Sydney Opera House, perhaps the most famous building, or most recognizable anyway, building in the world, is located in Australia. So something your SOL or final exam might like to do is they'll show you a picture of an item like this and say, this item is part of the cultural landscape of what country or region. And you need to know that Sydney Opera House is associated with Australia. And then we have thatched roof dwellings, which are found all throughout the Pacific Islands. The reason that there are thatched roof dwellings is because that is the type of material that those in the Pacific Islands had access to when building their dwellings. So this is important to recognize when you talk about your SOL or your final exam. For some reason, the SOL in the final exam, they love to ask about roofs. I don't quite get it, but that's what they like to ask about. And so you need to be able to recognize that thatched roofs are going to be common throughout the Pacific Islands, because really this is an example of someone using the materials that they have in order to build a house. You're not going to find thatched roof dwellings in Antarctica or even in Europe because they don't have access to these types of materials. All right, well, that about wraps up our review of Asia and Oceania and wraps up our Nearpod lesson. Just go ahead and head back to the Nearpod, complete their little review questions for the day, and then go back to the OMHS and complete those SOL review questions for a grade. This is also your final day of end of year review. Congratulations, you have made it. Wonderful work. And of course, if you have any questions about your eligibility to be exempt from that end of year exam, you can go ahead and send me an email, but I will be sending out information about that soon. Have a wonderful day, everyone.